Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the Guys at Magic. This is Hunter and David. Say what's up, David.
Yo, what's going on?
We are back with a upgrade video. This time, David is taking us through his upgrade video of Riveteer Rampage. What'd you do here, David?
So the face commander for this card is Hinsey Toolbox Tori. I think I'm saying that right. Talk about it down in the comments if I'm not. This guy is he's a black, a red, and a green for a creature that wants to really be able to abuse the blitz mechanic from this set, which I think is really cool. However, I actually didn't think he was the most interesting commander in this box. So, with that being said, I chose to kind of switch this one around, and instead of using the phase commander, I decided to actually use the backup, which is the Beamtown Bullies. My thought on this being is like the more that I wanted to build around the toolbox commander, the more I felt like I really wanted to be able to cast him a bunch of times. That way I could really make his blitz cost as cheap as possible. And the more I played around with that, the more that I realized if I just have the ability to cast him a ton of times, it means I have a bunch of mana and I can just actually cast the things without having to blitz them in. So I felt like he was kind of in a really weird spot for me where like I wanted him in play and then I wanted him to die. I don't know. He's kind of a funky commander in that regard.
I
Now,
gotcha.
the Beamtown Bullies I thought was actually much more interesting because it's kind of got like a little bit of a politics-esque feel to it in Jund, which is something that we don't typically get for that color combination. So just to read him off, he's one a black, a red, and a green for a 4/4 legendary creature, Ogre Devil Warrior. He's got Vigilance and Haste, and it says you can tap him. Target opponent whose turn it is puts target non-legendary creature card from your graveyard onto the battlefield under their control. It gains haste, goad it, and at the beginning of the next end step, exile it. So I really like the way that this guy kind of plays around with things, and there's a lot of really kind of crazy stuff that you can do with him for some pretty cheap upgrades.
He sounds pretty cool. I've heard a lot of people, especially on the subreddit of Magic, talk about really wanting to build around the Beamtime Bullies. So I'm excited to see where you take it.
Yeah, really, really kind of neat here. I also love the fact that I feel like this card is referencing multiple creatures, right? It says Ogre Devil Warrior. So we got the big ogre there in the middle with the beam, and then we got the two little devils kind of chilling on the side of it, maybe hanging up there with their lunch boxes or whatnot. So I think he's a cool card.
I like it a lot. All right, David. So let's start off with your additions first. What are we adding to this?
So I felt like really to be able to abuse this guy's ability, you not only want to be cheating in big creatures, but you also want to be cheating in creatures that have some potential downsides. That way you can really kind of hammer away at your opponents. And as it turns out, there's actually quite a few of these that are really gnarly and pretty cheap in terms of overall like actual price wise. So I feel like you can upgrade this deck at least kind of like impartial for very, very cheap. So to go ahead and take you through the suite of cards that I'm looking at adding in, the first one is Leveler. Leveler is 5 mana for a 10/10. It says whenever it comes into play, remove your library from the game. So this is a card that you never actually want to cast, but you'll love to reanimate this thing.
Yeah, giving that to your opponent is it's really mean.
Yeah, so this basically just nukes one of your opponent. It's going to exile out their library, and I don't really know of a whole lot of ways for them to be able to survive that hit. Plus, it also gives them a 10/10 that has to swing at one of your opponents for that turn. So that's another big body that's going to be coming in, hurting a second opponent too. So next up is Inverter of Truth. Inverter of Truth is 2 a black and a black for a 6/6 flying Eldrazi. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, exile all cards from your library face down, then shuffle all cards from your graveyard into your library. So not quite as impactful as Leveler. It is still going to be able to get rid of their library, and in most cases, that's probably going to be considerably larger than their graveyard. It also does kind of shut them down a little bit and put them on quite a bit more of a clock. So hopefully you'll be able to take them out. And if you do manage to get this thing out and play early enough, it'll probably just still have kind of that same effect where your opponent may only have a handful of turns left before they're just done.
Yeah, I can only imagine if you get this perfectly on curve. You
And
just kill someone.
That's the scary thing about this commander too, is he does have access to green, which means it's very easy for you to be able to ramp and get him out a turn early. And the haste factor in there, if you can set things up, you can start deploying these threats on pretty reliably on turn 4.
Some might call him a bully.
Yeah, he's pretty good at that. Hellcarver Demon is another one. This one is 3 and 3 black for a 6/6 demon. It's got flying, and it states whenever it deals combat damage to a player, sacrifice all other permanents you control and discard your hand. Exile the top 6 cards of your library. You may cast any number of non-land cards exile this way without paying their mana cost. There is a deal to be made with this. This could potentially backfire, I guess, if they end up kind of pulling the I don't know, top deck of the gods. However, sacrificing all other permanents that they control and discarding their hand is a massive penalty.
I think you just nuke someone if they have to sack all their lands.
I mean, absolutely. The only downside here is if they do flip over 6 impactful things, or heaven forbid, you flip over their 6 things that are actually going to like lock you out of the game. But I feel like most of the time, this is just going to absolutely wreck somebody's day.
I'd say so.
The next two that we're going to talk about, the first one here being Ebonbled Reaper. This is 2 and a black for a creature cleric. It's a 1/1, and it says whenever it attacks, you lose half your life rounded up. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player loses half his or her life rounded up. So not as impactful as the other 3 cards that we've talked so far, but still something that's really going to kind of pummel one of your opponents. Actually, in this case, potentially 2 if it does manage to deal that combat damage. It's still going to hurt a lot. Still a great reanimation target. Just not quite as heavy hitting as the other 3 we've talked about. Eater of Days is another really fun one. This is 4 mana for a 9/8 with flying and trample. It says whenever it comes into play, you skip your next 2 turns. So you just kind of lock somebody out for a little bit.
That's really mean, dude.
So those are going to be kind of like our prime targets in this deck. These are going to be the creatures that we really want to be able to hit and go after early on. So the next 3 cards I'm going to talk about, or actually the next couple of cards that I'm going to talk about, are cards that not only can you reanimate, but also some cards that you do want to be able to get into play under your control as well. So they kind of work both ways in that. The first 3 that I'm going to bring up, all 3 of these are going to be Eldrazi. There's Pathrazor of Ulamog, which is an 11 mana 9/9 with Annihilator 3. Ulamog's Crusher, which is an 8 mana 8/8 with Annihilator 2. And then the Bane of Balagad, which is a 7 mana 7/5. It doesn't have Annihilator, but it kind of still does. It doesn't have the keyword for it, but it says whenever it attacks, the defending player exiles 2 permanents he or she controls. And for those of you who are not familiar with Annihilator, the way that this mechanic works is whenever a creature attacks, the defending player has to sacrifice a number of permanents equal to that Annihilator clause. So Pathrazor of Ulamog, whenever it attacks, the defending player will sacrifice 3 permanents. Ulamog's Crusher, they'll sacrifice 2, and then Bane of Balagad, they'll sacrifice 2 as well. These can be really, really cool, especially if you can land these early enough as reanimation targets, because it can pummel your opponent's lands. This also helps to kind of just like clear up the board, as well as kind of help to mitigate what your other opponents are going to be doing. So all 3 of these cards, fantastic reanimation targets, as well as some pretty solid creatures in the case you end up making it to the later portions of the game and you have enough mana and resources to start dropping these on your own.
It is some of the meanest things you can do in Magic as Annihilator.
It's absolutely fantastic, but just keep in mind, you're not doing the Annihilator. You're forcing your friend to annihilate the other friend. And that's just the best part.
Unless you have them.
True. Unless you have them. They're just potential like reanimation targets with a little bit of upside.
Exactly.
The 4th card that I want to talk about here is Malignus. Malignus is 3 a red and a red, so he's only actually 5 mana, a little bit cheaper than the other ones that I just talked about. Malignus is a star, and it says that its power and toughness are each equal to half the highest life total among your opponents, rounded up. And it also says that damage that would be dealt by Malignus cannot be prevented. So the kind of cool thing about this is it's a 5-drop that can come down relatively early on in the game. And in most cases, this thing could be like a 20/20, just because if in the case that maybe one of your opponents haven't taken any life, it's going to be huge. This works even better if you're having to be playing up against maybe like a life gain deck, because this thing is going to grow even bigger. Plus, with it only costing 5 mana, it's pretty easy to be able to get this into play under your control. And then past that point, you can always reanimate this underneath one of your opponent's control in the case that Malignus does die. That way you can kind of get that additional swing and hopefully hurt him for quite a bit of damage.
Yeah, reanimate him as soon as you see that one of your other opponents doesn't have anything to block.
There you go. Or if you do see that, I don't know, maybe they have something preferable that they don't really want to block with. Maybe they just cast their commander a second or third time and they're looking at him being, well, do I really want to use my commander as just a body, or do I just want to take a massive amount of damage?
Seems pretty good.
Yeah, so those are going to kind of wrap it up for some of the reanimation targets. Now, one of the downsides of this pre-constructed deck is the fact that it really is not built around the Beamtown Bullies. I feel like for the most part, this deck was much more wanting to go with the toolbox commander because there's not really a whole lot of setup to help us get cards into the graveyard. So this next section is mainly going to be talking about some of our enablers and how we can assist the bullies. Unmarked Grave and Buried Alive both respectively allow us to search our library for cards to be able to put them directly into the graveyard. So the first one that we have is Unmarked Grave. This is 1 and a black. It's a sorcery. It says search your library for a non-legendary card, put that card into your graveyard, then shuffle. That's totally fine, and it actually synergizes with our commander anyways because we can't reanimate a legendary target. So this allows us to be able to go grab whatever it is we need, maybe one of our nuke buttons, maybe one of the big Eldrazi if we need one of those. Buried Alive is 2 and a black for a sorcery. It says search your library for up to 3 creature cards, put them into your graveyard, then shuffle your library. Same kind of an effect here. It's essentially just a tutor directly to the graveyard. Entomb is also going to be in part of this upgrade video. This is a single black mana for an instant. It says search your library for a card and put that card into your graveyard, then shuffle your library. This is hands down the best of these cards in terms of just general effect for this. If you are looking to make this deck any cheaper, though, this is, I think, the most expensive card in the upgrade list, eating up a pretty considerable portion of it. But being able to start your engine on turn 1 can be fantastic. So definitely worth it if you want to splurge on this card.
Definitely, Entomb is one of the best cards you can get in a reanimator deck.
Some of the other ones that we're going to be talking about are Grizzly Salvage. This is a black and a green for an instant. It says reveal the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a creature or a land card from among them into your hand, put the rest into your graveyard. For the most part, we're just going to be using this to be able to hopefully grab a land to help make sure that we can hit our land drops, and then putting all of those beautiful creature cards directly into the graveyard because we can still play with those toys. Well, we'll still have somebody else play with those toys for us. Gerard's Orders is 2, a black and a green for a sorcery. It says search your library for up to 2 creature cards and reveal them. Put 1 into your hand and the other into your graveyard, then shuffle your library. And Deadbridge Chant is 4, a black and a green for an enchantment. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, put the top 10 cards of your library into your graveyard. It also says at the beginning of your upkeep, choose a card at random in your graveyard. If it's a creature card, put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put it into your hand. This one in playtesting is a card that I might actually remove from here. It's definitely quite a bit of fun, and being able to mill the initial top 10 is fantastic. Just do keep in mind, if you have this in play, you need to be getting rid of those big drawback creatures with the bullies. You need to be reanimating them ASAP. You do not want to have one of them come onto the battlefield under your control. So Leveler, Inverter of Truth, Eater of Days, make sure that those are not in your yard.
It seems like a very odd card to put in here.
I mean, the initial being able to mill over the top 10 has been fantastic whenever I've been play testing this. I just do want to make sure that you're aware that there is the potential for those cards to bite you in the butt. At the same time, however, Deadbridge Chant is fantastic if you hit many of our other targets. So any of the Eldrazi that I talked about, aside from Inverter of Truth, because it's a way for you to just be able to cheat them into play, and then all of a sudden you have those creatures under your control for you to be able to swing away happily with.
Okay.
The next 2 cards are both dredgers that we're going to include in here. The first one is Stinkweed Imp. He's 2 and a black for a 1/2 with flying. It says that whenever Stinkweed Imp deals combat damage to a creature, destroy that creature. So it's like Death Touch before Death Touch was keyworded. It also has an ability on it saying Dredge and Dredge 5 on this card. And Dredge, if you don't know, it says if you would draw a card, instead you may put exactly the number that you dredge, so in this case 5 cards from the top of your library into your graveyard. If you do, return this card from your graveyard to your hand. Otherwise, draw a card. So Stinkweed Imp and Golgari Grave Troll both are going to be included in here, both of which are going to be dredgers. Golgari Grave Troll basically does the exact same thing in this deck, but it's going to dredge for 6 instead of 5. These are just going to be some engines. That way, in the case we do mill one of them over, or we do manage to get one of them into the graveyard, we can then continue to mill over the top couple of cards of our deck, make sure that we can continue to get those creatures that we really want to be reanimating into the graveyard.
Yeah, okay.
The last one that I want to talk about here in the setup area is going to be Fauna Shaman. Fauna Shaman is 1 and a green for a creature elf shaman. She's a 2/2 with pay a green and tap her to discard a creature card, search your library for a creature card, reveal it, and then put it in your hand, then shuffle your library. Fauna Shaman is absolutely fantastic for being able to tutor through cards in the deck, and once you have the card that you have found, she actually allows you to discard it the following turn to go find another piece. So she's a wonderful value engine here.
Seems very strong. The synergy is real.
Oh, dude, the synergy with this deck is absolutely insane. I do have to go ahead and put out a huge disclaimer with this, though. This is a commander that, depending on how your play group works, may end up kind of playing a little funky. So say, for example, if you do reanimate, I don't know, 2 of the big Eldrazi back to back, say, for example, you give player A a big Eldrazi and then he attacks player B with it and maybe, I don't know, annihilates and wipes out their lands. And then you give another player, maybe player C, one of the other big Eldrazi. Player C can attack the player who has nothing to kind of mitigate the annihilator effects. There are ways that your opponents can kind of play around with this to mess with you. And this is also a deck that whenever you get down to 1-on-1 gets a little weird. Your reanimation ability in this deck kind of shuts off. You can still be reanimating things and those creatures can't attack you, but then they're just not attacking anybody. So just keep in mind, I mean, you don't necessarily want to just be reanimating everything all the time. You do want to be at least somewhat strategic with it.
So like levelers, save for the last player.
Yeah, there you go. So save some of the big haymakers. Just keep in mind your opponents are probably going to see that you're setting up, dumping all these things into the graveyard. So there is an alternative strategy that I do want to throw into this deck as well, just in the case something does happen with our commander, or maybe things aren't going quite as well for us as what we had hoped. The first card that I want to talk about is Heartless Summoning. Heartless Summoning is 1 and a black for an enchantment. It says creature spells you cast cost 2 less to cast, and creatures you control get -1/-1. The -1/-1 isn't really that huge because we don't have a whole lot of 1/1s in this deck. And the creatures you cast cost 2 less to cast will help us get to some of those big fatties earlier. Plus, this deck actually, just out of the Precon, has a ton of really big creatures. All right, so next up we have Sneak Attack. Sneak Attack is 3 and a red for an enchantment. You can pay a red, and if you do, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. That creature gains haste. Sacrifice that creature at the beginning of the next end step. So this will help you be able to get that big creature into play for you to be able to swing around with. And at the end of your turn, you're going to have to sacrifice it. So it'll go to the graveyard ready for your commander to use and abuse. The next one here is going to be Through the Breach. Through the Breach is 4 and a red for an instant arcane. It says you may put a creature card from your hand on the battlefield. That creature gains haste. And then same kind of thing here. You're going to sacrifice that creature at the beginning of the next end step. So you'll be able to cheat a creature into play and then also be able to fuel your commander that way too.
Yeah, that seems very good.
So these are the upgrades. It is very much so a graveyard reanimation kind of centric deck. So do keep in mind if your opponents are going to be playing around with a lot of graveyard removal, which they probably should be, this deck can kind of take a little bit of a beating and isn't the most difficult to shut down. The other thing is the odd kind of politicking can create some weird scenarios. So just kind of think through what your opponents might be doing and how they're going to be incentivized.
Alrighty.
All right. So with that being said, how do we go about actually getting rid of some cards and making some space? Ultimately, by going through the commander deck, I am going to be removing a lot of the cards in here that I just kind of don't want to be reanimation targets. And since we are filling the deck with so many massively expensive creatures, it's going to be really kind of messing with our curve. I'm going to be removing a lot of the heavy drops from this deck. The first one here is Woodfall Primus. Woodfall Primus is 5, a green, green, and a green for a total of 8 mana. It's a 6-foot, or I'm sorry, it's a 6/6, not a 6-foot, tree folk shaman. It's got trample. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, destroy target non-creature permanent. We don't want to be able to reanimate this for our opponent because our opponents can use that ability to blow up something on our board. So just not really a card that I really want to give them. Tree Shaker Chimera is 5, a green and a green for an 8/5 Chimera. It says all creatures able to block Tree Shaker Chimera do so. Past that point, it also says whenever it dies, draw 3 cards. The whenever it dies part doesn't really matter a whole lot because whenever we're giving things to our opponents, they're going to exile. So it's fine. They're not going to be able to get that draw effect. I just didn't feel like this card quite made the cut as just an 8/5. Without, I guess, any additional way to push damage through. It does force our opponents to block, so I can see an argument for why this card would stay in. I just kind of wanted to cut down on some of the more expensive cards in the deck. Stalking Vengeance is 5, a red and a red for a 5/5 with haste. It says whenever another creature you control dies, it deals damage equal to its power to target player. Same kind of thing. I don't want to be able to give those kinds of effects to our opponents. In this case, it might be able to just kind of synergize and hurt us or hurt our life total. So not a really good reanimation target. I also don't really want to be paying 7 mana for a 5/5. Especially since like we're not the heaviest board presence deck. We're really trying to get our opponents to do the dirty work for us. Giant Aphid is 5, a green and a green for a 7/7 with trample. It says whenever it deals combat damage to a player, create a token that's a copy of Giant Aphid. This card gets absolutely insane if left unchecked. However, I've played around with this card a lot in Commander, and it's just never really been my favorite. For the most part, I feel like it's either always just kind of followed up with a board wipe or it's just so expensive it kind of sits around in my hand for the entire game. I'm not really super stoked on this, and it doesn't quite fit the reanimation theme, so I am going to remove this one.
Makes sense.
Sadly, one of the biggest money makers in this deck is also going to end up getting the axe, and this one is Avenger of Zendikar. Avenger of Zendikar is 5, a green and a green for a creature elemental. It's a 5/5, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, create a 0/1 green plant creature token for each land you control. It also has landfall. It says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a +1/+1 counter on each plant creature you control. Although this would be fantastic if we do end up casting this on our board, this is an awful reanimation target. We don't want to be giving our opponents that many blockers or that many creatures just kind of maybe even pump. So not really something that I want, although I will admit this is a pretty solid card if you do stick around with the toolbox commander. I just don't feel like he has quite the synergies we're looking for. The last card that I want to talk about in my category of horrible reanimation targets is Etali Primal Storm. This is 4, a red and a red for a legendary creature, Elder Dinosaur. It's a 6/6. It says whenever it attacks, exile the top card of each player's library. Then you may cast any number of spells from among those cards without paying their mana costs. Because this is a legendary creature, we actually can't reanimate this, even in the case that we wanted to with our commander, since you can't reanimate legendary creatures. This is essentially just going to be like a 6-drop in the deck that if we can cast would be fine, but I did want to make a little bit more room to be able to fit some of our new toys in.
That makes sense. My dino buddy is leaving.
This next category I'm just calling bad cards or cards that lack synergy, and I feel like there's a lot of new cards on this slide, so I'm probably going to get some hate.
Tell me what you're taking out.
Well, let's do this. I'll go ahead and sugarcoat by starting with some of the older cards, some of the reprints that I'm not the biggest fan of. The first one here is Kresh the Bloodbraided. This is 2, a black, a red, and a green for a legendary creature, Human Warrior. He's a 3/3, and it says whenever another creature is put into a graveyard from play, you may put X +1/+1 counters on Kresh the Bloodbraid, where X is that creature's power. This is a 5-drop that is just going to turn into a really big, dumb beater. I don't like big, dumb beaters typically unless there's something that I can do with them. I can't reanimate this. Even if I could reanimate this, or even if I do get this into play, if I'm reanimating things for my opponent, they're getting exiled, so Kresh isn't growing. He just doesn't quite match up. Aether Snap is 3 a black and a black for a sorcery. It says remove all counters from all permanents and exile all tokens. This 100% feels like a card that was added into this deck to play against the other pre-constructed decks. Maybe get rid of some shield tokens. I'm sorry, the shield counters, but this is not something that I want to be playing around with in most decks. I don't care about this kind of weird wannabe board wipe that's not actually a board wipe.
Definitely feels like it was put in this deck specifically against Cabaretti.
Yeah, there's two. There's 2 decks for the precons that really care about either counters or tokens, and this feels like it was kind of pushed up against those. But out in the Wild West, I'm not super worried about those. Evolutionary Leap is 1 and a green for an enchantment. You can pay a single green mana, sacrifice a creature, reveal the top card of your library until you reveal a creature card. Put that card into your hand and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. If that said graveyard, I would have loved this card, but this isn't really helping us out with our synergy here. And lastly, the last reprint on this Bad Cards or No Synergy is Warstorm Surge. Warstorm Surge is 5 and a red for an enchantment. It says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. I've never actually really been much of a fan of this card unless I'm capable of really abusing ETB effects or be able to really hammer down and recast and reanimate something on my side of the field. We're not doing that though in this deck. Most of our big drops are going to be coming in under our opponent's control. As far as the new cards that are going to end up getting the axe, there's quite a few of them in here, so buckle up. The first one is Dodgy Jalopy. Jalopy? How do I say this card?
Dodgy Jalopy.
Jalopy. That sounds like an Italian dish. I'll take one a jalopy. All right, it's 2 and a green for an artifact vehicle. It's an X5 or a star 5. I'm sorry, and it says its power is equal to the highest mana value among creatures you control. It's got a crew of 3. I don't really care much for this card. I think that this is kind of cool. It can be big. I'm just not really looking for this kind of an effect. It doesn't work with the graveyard. I don't like how it's creature dependent on having something else being able to crew this. So, no. Next up is Weathered Sentinels. This is 3 generic mana for an artifact creature wall. It's a 2/5 with Defender, Vigilance, Reach, and Trample. A very odd keyword soup. It says that it can attack players who attacked you during their last turn as though it didn't have Defender. And whenever it attacks, it gets +3/+3 and gains indestructible until end of turn. So they are statues that wait until you have been hurt for them to actually really do anything. I'm not a big fan of this. There's kind of like a very mild Defender sub-theme in this deck, which I just kind of felt was odd. So I am going to be removing this card. First Responder is another one that we're going to end up removing here. This is 3 and a green for an Ogre Citizen. It's a 3/3 with Vigilance, and it says at the beginning of your end step, you may return another creature you control to its owner's hand, then put a number of +1/+1 counters equal to that creature's power on First Responder. I don't know what to think of this card. If this worked at like instant speed or had an activated ability where we could use this to maybe save our commander, I think that this card could be great. Because of its weird timing restrictions and because it's bouncing things back to our hand, plus it's just kind of making this, once again, a big dumb beater, I'm not really down on this card. There's also not a whole lot of ETB effects that I really want to abuse in this deck, so he loses a lot of his value. I do think that this would be a fantastic card had you stuck with the original commander, though. That way you'd be able to dash things in and then, of course, be able to... I'm sorry, not dash those in. My bad. The other keyword, the one that works very similarly to it, to blitz them in and then be able to bounce them back to your hand instead of sacrificing them instead at the end of turn. Next of kin is up next. I didn't mean to do that on purpose, but it's 2 and a green. It's an enchantment aura. It says enchant creature. When enchanted creature dies, you may put a creature card you own with lesser mana value from your hand or from the command zone onto the battlefield. If you do, return next of kin to the battlefield attached to that creature at the beginning of the next end step. I'm not a big fan of this effect once again in this deck. I actually do want my things to die so that I can reanimate them, and this kind of directly works against that. I can use this as like a pseudo protection outlet for my commander. Um, Still kind of a little bit too of a niche card here, so I am going to remove this one. The last new card that we're going to be removing from bad cards and or just no synergy is Industrial Advancement. Industrial Advancement is 3 and a red. It's an enchantment that says, at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice a creature. If you do, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is that creature's mana value. You better put a creature card from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest to the bottom of your library in a random order. Now, this is a card that could potentially be able to grab us something nice if we want to, and it does actually fuel the graveyard. The problem that I have with this is I feel like in most situations we already need to have a big threat in order for Industrial Advancement to really kick off. I don't want to be sacrificing one of those, say, big Eldrazi that we could be potentially swinging in, or really any of the other big creatures that we want to be beating face and building up our board state with.
That makes sense.
And I also see that you're removing Turf War here as well.
And finally, 3 more cards that we're going to be getting rid of here. The first one is actually going to be just Henzi Toolbox Tori himself. That's the face commander. He seems like he's a very interesting card, and I can definitely see people wanting to go out and build decks around him. I just don't really think he works all that well in the Beamtown deck.
Beamtown Bullies ain't got no room for a toolbox.
Life's Legacy is another card that we're going to be removing here. This is 1 and a green for a sorcery. It says, as an additional cost to cast Life's Legacy, sacrifice a creature, then draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. Our deck is 100% light on card draw. I'm going to go ahead and admit that. I do think that we probably could use some better card draw in the deck. I don't think Life's Legacy is the way to do it. Oftentimes, I found that if you're going to be casting this, you're probably going to be targeting a smaller utility creature, which may only draw you like a card or two. And if that's the case, I think that there's better options out there over Life's Legacy. Same thing as kind of what I mentioned earlier. I may not want to be sacrificing one of the big things, because if I do have it in play under my control, I'm probably doing okay. Reign of Riches is the next non-land, or the last non-land card that I'm going to talk about here. Reign of Riches is 3, a red and a red for an enchantment, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, you create 2 treasure tokens. It also says the first spell you cast each turn, that mana value from a treasure was spent to cast has Cascade. This is a 5 mana enchantment that can be absolutely insane. But including this card, there are 2 treasure makers in the entire deck. I don't know how good this is.
Yeah, it seems like it needs a little bit more support.
I mean, on its own, it can potentially proc itself twice, which could be good enough to warrant it being included. It could also totally whiff on its Cascade and hit something that you don't really want. Plus, the fact that there's only 2 token makers in the deck means that you're not really going to be able to use and abuse this. This would be much better suited in a dedicated treasures deck. This deck does start off with 39 lands, so the last 2 cards I'm going to talk about are just lands. I feel like 39 is incredibly high, even considering the fact that we're playing with an absurdly high mana cost, absurdly high mana value deck. We've got some huge beefy things in there, but I don't really want to be drawing a ton of lands over the course of the game. The first one we're going to talk about here is Myriad Landscape. I just, out of personal preference, hate this card. It enters the battlefield tapped, and after that, it taps for a colorless. You can tap it and sacrifice it to be able to go grab 2 basic lands, which is fine, but you can't even mix and match at that because they have to share a land type. So you're grabbing 2 forests, 2 mountains, or 2 swamps.
Yeah.
I've never liked this card. This is one that kind of always gets the axe. This is like the Temple of the False God for me, where it's just like I see it and it's an automatic deduction from the deck. I just get rid of them. Blighted Woodland is another land that I want to remove here. This is a land that taps for a colorless mana. And then you can pay 3 and a green if you do sacrifice it and search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. Blighted Woodland, I do think, is better than Myriad Landscape. You can mix and match, which at least helps you out a little bit with the mana fixing. Same kind of thing here, though. You have to pay mana to basically have a slow fetch. I'm not the biggest fan of these cards.
That makes sense. So is that it? Is that all we're doing?
That is it.
All right. So what's the bad boy total on here?
Well, looking at my card currently on TCG Player, this comes out to $99.58, not including shipping fees.
That's perfect. You hit it. $100.
Right there, as close as I could possibly get it.
As close as you can get it. That's great. Any last thoughts to say about this Beamtown Bullies?
I am super excited to do the $300 upgrade for this because I do think that the mana base on this deck specifically needs a lot of work. And because the core of this deck is so incredibly cheap, we might be able to play around with that. Plus, there are a couple of other big beaters that I did not include in this list just because of the price tag on them. So I think this is a deck that for $100, this could be a very real threat at a table. And for 300x, you could have yourself a pretty optimized list.
Sounds like you're teasing the people with your $300 list. I can't wait to see that.
Me too. I should probably start on it.
As always, the whole deck list is going to be in the description down below on Moxfield. So if you guys want to go and take a look at all Dave's upgrades, the entire deck by itself, click that link. Let us know what you think in the comments down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We will be doing the rest of the $100 commander lists as soon as we get them. Until next time, hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Peace.
Later.